Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I'm Ryan Wormeli, joined today by Pat Fitzmaurice and by a special guest. We're joined by John Daigle of Establish the Run. John, we were just talking before the show about how this is kind of guest spot season at this point in the summer as we get ready for draft season in a couple of months. So I appreciate you making the time for us.
Always happy to join the Fantasy Pros crew. My other friends, Debro, Andrew Erickson, Pisa Pia, of course, usually are with me around this time, but I don't often get to overlap with yourself, Ryan, or Fitz, so just excited to talk to everyone there.
We are very excited to have you. I was telling you before the show too that Joe had let me know that we had booked you as the guest for today's show, and then Fitz hadn't seen that, and he was like, "Hey, Worm, do we need to get a guest? I have some guys in mind." And the first guy he had in mind was the person we had already booked for the show in you, so it worked out well. And you were always destined to be on this episode. It appears. We are going to be talking some top 50 running back rankings and tiers. Just to let everybody know, all of our early 2024 consensus rankings and tiers can be found at fantasypros.com/rankings. We're going to go through the top 6 tiers. It's actually going to get us to the top 51 running backs to get through those 6 tiers. And we're just going to kind of react to it, see who we think's missing from these tiers, if the order's right, who's maybe too high, too low, and see as we stand here at the end of May what we think about the running back rankings. Fitz, does that sound good?
That sounds great. And, it's great to converse with Mr. Daigle again. We haven't seen each other since last, I think, September in our Chicago Media League draft. Mm-hmm. So, always good to catch up with John.
We're going to have some fun here today. Let's dive right in because we do have 51 names to get through. Tier 1, just 3 names deep, though. It's Christian McCaffrey. He's going to be the number 1 overall pick in most leagues that you're in, probably. Then it's Breece Hall at RB2 and Bijan Robinson at RB3. So, John, what was your first reaction when seeing just those 3 names as their own tier right at the top?
Makes a bunch of sense. Tiers are always differentiated based on how people are parsing them. When I go like in draft tiers, I like to be a little bit heavier. So I think our tiers are going to be the same, but I personally may have them dissected in that I only want Christian McCaffrey in a tier of himself, right? Like I only want him with CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase as the players who you could take 101 overall. But honestly, with the other 2 guys, that would be the next tier for me. So all I'm doing is literally separating our tiers here. But Bijan, Breece Hall, however anyone wants to scramble them, of course, is totally fine. For Bijan, we have Arthur Smith out of the way. For Breece Hall, we have Dalvin Cook out of the way. And just another full offseason removed from the last injury that hampered him out the gates last year. So, yeah, those are the big 3. I don't think anyone could argue with that.
Fitz, what do you think about John's point about CMC maybe deserving his own tier? Because I think, we've done a couple of these tiers based on position episodes already together, Fitz. I think running back is the only position that you would be maybe willing to make that case for, that there is a tier of 1 at the top for this season. Would you say that about CMC, or do you think it is a tier of 3?
No, I agree with John. I mean, I think CMC is probably a tier unto himself at running back. And then, maybe a second, sort of a later first round tier with Bijan and Breece Hall. And maybe for some people, Jonathan Taylor or Jahmyr Gibbs could possibly sneak into that late first round tier. But so I do agree with that. And to me, it's kind of the interesting, I think people are sort of divided on Breece Hall versus Bijan. If you're thinking first round running back, I have Bijan higher. I think the consensus says Breece, but I mean, the Falcons have the easiest schedule in the league coming up this year, according to Warren Sharp. They were graded 7th in run blocking by PFF last year, where the Jets were 27th. And Bijan hasn't torn his ACL before. So I like him a little more than Breece, but I do think they're both worthy first round picks, especially when we're so short on workhorse running backs, and both of these guys are probably going to be true workhorses.
So, John, if we assume CMC goes 1, again, I think that'll be the case in most drafts, how many wide receivers need to come off the board before you're then turning to your choice of Breece or Bijan?
I think it's 3 for me, 4 if you're in PPR leagues. I'm going to throw Amon-Ra St. Brown in there in PPR leagues. The Lions also have, and we'll probably talk about this with a lot of Lions players, the Lions have a really good run out in that they only play 3 games outdoors all year. Unfortunately, 2 of them are in your fantasy playoffs in week 16 and 17. But beyond that, for the regular season, Jared Goff and the Lions can certainly get you there. So for PPR, AAR speed for me. Outside of that, if you're in half PPR standard, I'm going to take AAR speed ADP and his high catch floor out of there, and only mention the 3 guys I talked about earlier: Tyreek, CeeDee Lamb, and Jamar Chase.
Fitz, what do you think? Same question. At what point, assuming CMC and then X number of receivers, are you turning to Bijan?
I think it is, for me, Tyreek, Lamb, Chase. Then I debate with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Justin Jefferson whether I might actually take Bijan over either of those guys, just because it's hard to get a foothold at running back if you miss the first 4 or 5 guys. Then it's like there are just so few bankable things at running back beyond the top 5 that even though maybe it might not feel like the right thing to do, especially in a PPR format, I might be willing to push it a little bit and then just kind of ignore running back for the next 6-7 rounds.
The only thing I'll say about Justin Jefferson, because right now that's also the most popular screenshot on social media, is everyone gets Justin Jefferson around 106, 109 in best ball. And then they show everyone because it looks sexy on paper. I get it. But remember last year, we basically have 4 games with him at full strength with Kirk Cousins, and then 4 games at the end of the year, not only without Kirk Cousins, but also no T.J. Hawkinson. And although everyone likes to cite the production that Nick Mullins, Jaron Hall had through the air, Nick Mullins, multiple 400-yard passing games, Justin Jefferson quietly averaged 6 fewer half PPR points per game in that 4-game stretch at the end of the year, because the accuracy of those targets are not similar to Kirk Cousins' targets at all. And so I am somewhat concerned, and Justin Jefferson's still my wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, so it's not even like a heavy argument. I get it, but I am concerned the target tree is much more ambiguous than we think from Sam Darnold. Like, there's a bottom there that probably Justin Jefferson has never experienced in his career, or maybe he doesn't deserve to be in that top tier. So I personally am just a little bit wary of the situation.
I'm going to be winding up with a lot of Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson on my rosters for that type of reason, where you can poke just enough holes in some of the wide receivers where I'm still comfortable getting another guy in round 2 or 3 or whatever. At running back, I do feel like once you get past the top, 9 or 10, like there's definitely like running backs I'll be fine having on my roster and you can build the upside case for, but there's really not that many that I'm feeling real strong about. I'm very happy to have this guy as my hero RB or whatever strategy I'm using. Fitz, what do you think about that as kind of like the overall, just the state of the position? Is this a deep position this year, or is this a position where you really want to come out of the first 1 or 2 rounds with a guy?
I mean, I don't know if it's not 1 or 2 rounds. It's that top 5. Like, if I don't get one of the top 5, I'm not forcing the issue. Like tier 3, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but tier 3 scares the daylights out of me. And I really don't want anyone from that tier, quite honestly.
What do you think about that, John? Just kind of the overall state of the position.
We know that running backs are becoming more committee, which is why, Christian McCaffrey we think is so important, because it's not a committee there whatsoever. Bijan Breece probably get that bump. I'm definitely worried about the next few guys we'll talk about here, which make me then want to lean on, to your point, Bijan or Breece amid the range of Garrett Wilson, Drake London, however everyone else has those receivers parsed. I just think it's literally a coin toss, and it's based on how you perceive the running back position. But as we're about to talk about this tier 2, 3, 4, there are a lot of concerns here. I think there are more blemishes than ever before among these guys that make most of them ignorable for receivers in that range. And if you're doing that, maybe then you do just go ahead and start your draft with one of those 2 at the top.
Let's get into tier 2 now. It runs from RB4 through RB8. The names are Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, Kyron Williams, and Travis Etienne. So, John, to me, those first 2 are kind of a step above the next 3. I do really like Taylor and I do really like Gibbs. I think it's fair to have them in tier 2 and not in tier 1. But to me, those are the very easy 2 guys at the top of tier 2. Do you see it that way, or would you put maybe another name in that range?
I'm going to have Devon Achane, personally, sprinkled among that group. But honestly, in your home league, you're probably waiting until the second, third round turn for Achane, and that's going to be where he's most valuable. He's basically arbitrage off of Jahmyr Gibbs. Love Jahmyr Gibbs as a player. We already talked about the Lions environment that they're going into this year, but also remember, Gibbs and David Montgomery played 12 games together when the Lions returned from their bye. Before that, one or the other was always out, which allowed that other person who was healthy to have a ceiling and reach his maximum touches. But in those 12 games together, David Montgomery actually out-touched Jahmyr Gibbs by 10 total touches, including the playoffs. Montgomery's not a player who's going away despite Gibbs' talent, because Montgomery does all the dirty work that coaches love. And honestly, he was good. Like, he wasn't great, but he was just good enough to stay on the field. So I'm a little bit worried about Gibbs. If you can get him in the middle of the second round, especially in PPR leagues, that's where you're going to see the most return on your investment. But at the end of the first round, I am admittedly a little concerned about Gibbs personally.
Fitz, anybody who has ever listened to this show knows that you were going to have Jonathan Taylor, at the top of this tier. So that's thoroughly unsurprising. Do you want to make the case for Taylor as maybe even being deserving of consideration as a tier 1 guy, or you're willing to accept him in tier 2 as long as he's at the top?
Yeah, I don't think he's that far. I think he's clearly at the top of tier 2, and you could make the case that he belongs in the back of tier 1 just because let's forget about the last couple of years where Taylor missed extensive playing time. Let's go back to 2021 when he had 1,800 plus rushing yards, over 2,000 yards from scrimmage, 20 touchdowns. And now he gets to play with Anthony Richardson, who, with the rushing threat he poses, I think it's probably going to spike Taylor's efficiency. And like the RPO stuff is just going to work splendidly with the Colts, with those two running stuff. Like, I can't wait to see what it looks like, because we didn't get to see Richardson and Taylor play together last year. Like, it's going to be exciting, and just pray for Taylor's good health, because I do think he's going to provide something close to first round value if he does stay healthy all year.
It's definitely a better bet, in my opinion, than Saquon Barkley. You don't have the age apex concerns, and Anthony Richardson's a different quarterback than Jalen Hurts, in that we know Hurts has led the Eagles and carries inside the 5-yard line for 3 consecutive seasons now. Barkley's just not going to get those short equity rushing touchdowns that have kept so many running backs who have been pigeonholed off the goal line down for so long, DeAndre Swift included last year. So there are major red flags for Barkley in that ADP range this year.
Yeah, I agree. Fitz, how are you evaluating Barkley right now?
I kind of feel the same way Daigle does. Like, there's no denying that Philadelphia is going to be a better ecosystem for Barkley than the Giants were, but we have concerns about, Jalen Hurts is not a big check down guy. And as it is, Barkley hasn't really been exciting in the passing game since like 2019. And then, the short touchdowns, like even if the tush push is used less frequently, say with the retirement of Jason Kelce, the Eagles' outstanding center, like that's still Jalen Hurts territory. So maybe there is a little bit of a cap on his touchdown. Like I would not feel good about drafting Barkley in the second round. Like I'm not totally out on him. I think he could have a good season, but it's just hard to justify taking him in the second.
John, I want to ask you about Kyren Williams. He's a really difficult guy for me to try to rank this year because, like, obviously when he was on the field, like besides Christian McCaffrey, was there a more fun running back to have on your roster last year when he was playing? I mean, it was a delight to have picked up Kyren Williams early or drafted him late and get what you got out of him. But at the same time, there was injury stuff. They drafted Blake Corum on day 2. There's just enough red flags to feel like, the lack of track record to feel like, well, wow, RB7, that's pretty high. But at the same time, when he was playing, that would have been a value last year. So how do you kind of parse through all that and evaluate Kyren Williams?
I still think he's at the bottom of this tier. He last year, he was the rich man's version of Rachaad White, and that they both got the same workload, but one of them was really good and the other one wasn't. We'll talk about White when we get there, but overall, yes, Blake Corum, as you mentioned, with not significant, but respectable capital on day 3. So the report right now, the most recent one is Adam Schefter saying out of camp that they want to keep Kyren Williams around 15 touches per game. Still respectable. But again, if it's based on volume, those are typically the guys we try to avoid guys in this range who, if they're only getting there due to volume, then yes, that's concerning. Again, if I'm starting like a hero RB build because I start with 2 wide receivers in my home league, I don't mind Kyren Williams to start the 3rd round. If he's going to be reached on beyond that, probably not a player I'll have.
Fitz, the last guy in this tier is somebody who, in all the shows we've done together this offseason, I feel like we've never mentioned Travis Etienne's name. Is he becoming kind of a forgotten man? Should we be talking about him more? You are a couple spots lower than consensus on him, but what do you make of Etienne in this tier right now?
Good question. I'm not sure what to make of him because it was a Jekyll and Hyde season for him in 2023. Like, he was, for the first 8 weeks of the season, averaging better than 20 PPR points per game and was like running back 2 in that category. And then after the Jaguars went on bye in week 9, come back in week 10, from that point on through the end of the season, he averaged 13.2 PPR points per game and was RB 21 in that category. So it was just like hard to understand what happened. I know I had Travis Etienne in a league last year where like wrapped up a playoff spot early and then just completely petered out at the end of the season and bowed out in my first game. And Etienne's drop off was part of that. And now we've got Doug Peterson talking about wanting to use Tank Bigsby more, which isn't exactly reassuring if you're thinking about investing in Etienne. So I'm kind of out on Travis Etienne.
John, what do you think about Etienne? I mean, RB8, too high, too low, just right?
Probably too high still, given the reports that are coming out of camp, wanting, as Fitz mentioned, to reinstall Bigsby. They tried last year, but he was called tanking Bigsby for a reason. Every touch did not go the way it should have. The greatest low light reel in the NFL last year was every single Bigsby catch and carry. So right now, yes, everyone spent last year complaining about Tony Pollard when really he had the same usage as Travis Etienne. One was scoring touchdowns, though. Pollard was not. And so that's always concerning. Yeah, to me, it's just not a situation, not an ADP where I probably will have much of Etienne waiting on running backs a little longer or, again, latching on to Devon Achane, Kyren Williams type of player.
It's time to start looking ahead to the NFL season with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Get a jump start on the season with futures bets on division winners, win totals, stat leaders, and so much more. Explore the latest odds on which rookies will have the most passing or receiving yards, or check out futures for your favorite teams and players on the DraftKings Sportsbook app. One bet I'm looking at right now is the AFC Conference race. Obviously, the Chiefs are favored at plus 300. I'm intrigued by Baltimore at plus 475, of course. Cincinnati's plus 700, Buffalo plus 700. Houston plus 850. The Texans bet looks particularly intriguing to me given all the pieces around Stroud headed into year 2. For a long shot, not saying I'd be rushing out to bet this. The Colts at plus 3,500. Interesting to me as well, as long as Richardson stays healthy, of course. However you plan to bet your NFL futures, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code FantasyPros. New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. That's code FantasyPros only on DraftKings. The crown is yours. Guys, let's move to tier 3 here. This runs from RB9 to RB16. It's Derrick Henry, Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, Rachaad White, Devon Achane, Joe Mixon, James Cook, and Kenneth Walker. Now, John, you already mentioned that Achane was somebody that you would probably have a bit higher than this, right?
I like to spend my elite capital on players that can literally break the game of fantasy football. If you're wrong, that still have a high floor, but if you're right, literally win you your leagues. And that's where Achane fits in this tier, but to me, it's still a top of it. Like if Achane outscores both Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, it would not be shocking whatsoever given the direction those players are heading. Very quickly on Josh Jacobs too, because I think like last year, this is going to be a big discussion points in drafts. Very easily a fadeable player based on leading the league in touches last year. We've seen those touches the last decade. 5 running backs have reached 390 plus. We've seen them just wear it on their bones the following year, and they're extremely inefficient. And what's happening this year so far in best ball leagues, early redraft leagues, is that everyone is now perceiving a bounce back. I don't like to consider that, though, considering we look at the entire arc of Josh Jacobs' career. He's been in the league 5 years, and that one season everyone talks about from a couple years ago, that was his only one as a top 12 running back in points per game. You should actually consider that anomaly, in my opinion. Not only that, but remember, you got the number 1 seed with Josh Jacobs. You entered the playoffs, and that run stopped in week 14. Since then, we've now seen 18 games going back to 2 years ago and last season, and he's literally been one of the worst running backs in the league, comparable to Ezekiel Elliott by all metrics. So to me, it's an easy player to avoid. Not only that from a micro player perspective, but if you want to make the argument that everyone's doing, got paid, good offense, workhorse, whatever, just wait 2 more rounds and draft Joe Mixon. It's literally the same argument you're making. So to me, I'm just avoiding Josh Jacobs for not only the player perspective, but also the overarching type of how I draft.
Fitz, firstly on Achane, you've been kind of the Achane guy on the Dynasty podcast and, on our main show here as well. So I assume you're in agreement that he is maybe a bit underranked. Would you have him at the top of this tier or even as high as the back end of tier 2?
Yeah, I would have him at the top of this tier. And if you are in on Jahmyr Gibbs, there's no reason you shouldn't be in on Achane. Because and Daigle sort of pointed this out. Like I think it was from week 10 on. Early in the season, it was kind of hard to get a read on Jahmyr Gibbs because David Montgomery missed 3 games. Gibbs missed a game or 2 himself. And like early in the season when they were playing together, they were sort of keeping Gibbs on ice a little bit. But late in the season, from week 10 on, I think Gibbs averaged like 11.3 carries a game and wasn't like a really prolific pass catcher, like 16 point some yards per game receiving. So you're going to get, that's a Devon Achane type workload. And like Gibbs, Achane is so efficient and so explosive that he can make that workload work and give you, low end RB1, high end RB2 production. But there's just no reason to be drafting him that much lower than Jahmyr Gibbs. So yeah, I'm very much in on him.
We talk about these running backs and like their AJ picks, their workloads. Like it's good because Achane is not someone you're worried about the workload. Like in those 9 full games, he only averaged 12 touches per game. If his workload is not going to go down, right? We're only reaching for his ceiling. So I'm not worried about his splits because he's always going to split touches at his size. Not only that, but I think people are worried about the addition of Jalen Wright in the 4th round. But really, like, we should not just only tack that on to Achane's workload. We should say what happens to Raheem Mostert here, because we should be looking for ways to hedge off of Mostert. That was the most 17.8 points per game for any running back age 31 or older since Tiki Barber in 2006. It's just not sustainable what Mostert did in his 9th season to have a career high in touches and touchdowns. So how do I hedge off of Mostert with a ceiling player? To me, it just all leads back to 3rd round Achane.
One name that I want to highlight here, and I've talked about him a lot on other episodes, but like Derrick Henry, I don't think he's underranked. I'm just going to be taking a lot of him where he's going. If you guaranteed me health for every running back in the NFL, just say, hey, nobody's getting hurt this year, there's not a running back I would be more willing to bet on scoring 15 touchdowns this year besides Christian McCaffrey than Derrick Henry. I just think the way the Ravens are going to plan to use him in that offense, if he's healthy, I just don't see how he scores fewer touchdowns than Gus Edwards did a year ago. And if anything, the ceiling I think is much higher than that. I've said it before, they don't like to run Lamar when they're up close. They're very happy to let him hand it off to a running back when they're in close. And they signed Derrick Henry for a reason. I'm very excited about him where you can get him in drafts this year. Again, I'm not saying he should be up in tier 2 or anything like that, but I think a big touchdown season is coming, assuming health for Henry. John, what do you think about Derrick Henry?
They're always going to be a running offense, even with Todd Monken last year. I know game scripts skewed a lot of the Ravens' games and performances. That's why Lamar Jackson was upsetting in fantasy lineups, but was also MVP of the league. They just blew out teams with great efficient offense and great defense. But also for Derrick Henry, that's why I listened to arguments about him. My only concern is that he's going to go far too high for that perception in home leagues. I think he's going to be a lot like Josh Jacobs, where I arrived in Vegas ahead of week 1 last year. Josh Jacobs was a 4th round player as he should be. But in home leagues still that opening weekend, he was still a 1st or 2nd round player. I kind of think that's how Derrick Henry is going to be. Everyone's latching on to it. So a little worried about him. Other than that, though, if he does go to the 3rd or 4th round, completely fine with it because he's a Martian. He is the anomaly. He doesn't bottom out like Josh Jacobs does. He still has a high floor.
Fitz, the last 2 names I really want to highlight in this tier because they're really interesting to me at the bottom of the tier are James Cook at 15 and Kenneth Walker at 16. I think you can make pretty reasonable upside cases for both those guys, but you can also make downside cases as well. Does one of those 2 stand out to you as maybe being somebody you'll be more willing to draft aggressively this year?
I kind of like both at their price relative to a lot of the other guys in this tier. Walker is a guy, he might be the guy from this tier who I wind up having on more of my fantasy teams than any other. year. It seems like the presence of Zach Charbonnet is sort of scaring people away from Walker. But when they played together, well, Walker averaged 16.5 touches a game last year. And in games that Charbonnet played when Walker was active, Charbonnet averaged 7.4 touches. So like this is clearly the Walker show. And I think like people shouldn't be letting the second round draft capital spent on Zach Charbonnet freak them out about Walker, because Seattle throughout pretty much the entirety of the Pete Carroll era showed a willingness to spend early round draft capital on running backs, but it didn't always mean much. I mean, we saw Rashad Penny drafted in the first round and sit behind Chris Carson for 2+ years in Seattle. So like, don't worry about Charbonnet stealing Walker's thunder. I think Walker's better. No running back has forced more missed tackles than Walker over the last 2 years since coming into the league. Like he's been really good. Probably isn't going to be a prolific pass catcher, but helps a little bit in that category. I just feel like where he's going, kind of in the running back dead zone, he's kind of a sneaky good value.
John, what do you think about those two? Do you have a preference between Cook and Walker?
Walker for sure. I'm a little bit worried about James Cook just because Buffalo tried to take him off the field or pigeonhole him into a singular role between the 20s every chance they got. That's why at the end of the year, they started rotating through Latavius Murray, who was literally the league's worst goal line back, so they had to get him off. Leonard Fournette, who was clearly just aged out of his playing years, so had to get him off. And they just started using Ty Johnson in the playoffs because, again, they were looking for anything else. With the addition of Ray Davis, who is a pass catching back, I worry about Davis's like dynasty stock long term. But in year one under Joe Brady, I do think Davis could make an impact and eat into James Cook's overall touches. So at this ADP, I'm going to be saying this a lot, by the way. Just drink every time I say it. At this ADP, I don't think I'm taking this player, and that includes James Cook.
That's fair. Let's go to tier 4 here. RB 17 to RB 24. Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner, Zamir White, DeAndre Swift, and Najee Harris. Again, that's RB 17 to RB 24. We're in tier 4. Fitz, who stands out to you here? Anybody too high, too low?
Some people might think Alvin Kamara is ranked a little too highly, but I have to admit to being sort of intrigued by how the Saints picked the fruit of the old Mike Shanahan, Gary Kubiak coaching tree by bringing in Clint Kubiak as their offensive coordinator and Rick Dennison as an offensive assistant. And I mean, Dennison was with those old Broncos teams under Shanahan and Gary Kubiak that routinely churned out like valuable fantasy running backs year after year. And not just Terrell Davis and Clinton Portis, but these one-year wonder guys like Olandis Gary and Reuben Drones and Tatum Bell. I wonder if maybe we could see sort of a late career renaissance from Alvin Kamara, whose efficiency has kind of dipped the last 2 or 3 years. Maybe that's unrealistic going into his age 29 season, and we should really be looking at Kendre Miller instead. I want some of Kendre Miller too. But so Kamara kind of intrigues me. Otherwise, I think most of the guys in this tier are pretty fairly priced.
I think you're probably right about them being fairly priced. It's not a tier I think I'm going to be like playing around too much in on draft day. There's just not a lot of very inspiring names in here. It's a lot of picks where it's like, yeah, I mean, sure, probably boring vet. Like they might end up getting you the numbers at the end of the day, but there's nobody that you're going to pick in this tier where everybody else in the draft room is going to be like, oh man, he was next in my queue. I can't believe you snaked him from me. I don't think you're going to be getting a lot of that in this range. John, what do you think?
I'll put out the easy disclaimer for Zamir White for everyone, because the same people that drafted Alexander Madison last year are probably going to be drafting Zamir White. And he's just not the bucket of player we should ever be reaching for in fantasy football. Don't make the Mike Davis, Chase Edmonds mistake again as well. Zamir White maxed out at 169 touches in 3 seasons at Georgia in a single season. He's only earned 136 total touches through 2 NFL seasons. And then last year, if you look at their schedule, whenever White did handle those 23 touches per game that everyone remembers, is not only favorable due to the teams they were playing, at that same time, he wasn't a 3-down back. He ran just 17 more routes than Amir Abdullah. So what happens if the Raiders are bad and just get out of favorable game scripts? It's not going to be favorable for Zamir White. So I think he's the landmine this year, a la Madison last year, where you should absolutely be avoiding in this range.
Fitz, is there anybody that you think is missing from this tier that, you know, we're going to get to later that you actually think should be up here?
I don't think so. I mean, like Raheem Mostert might be the easiest case for that. But again, as Daigle said, what are the odds that Mostert stays healthy all season? And, like he did have the most touches of his career last year. And he's not going to score 21 touchdowns again either. So, yeah, like I don't think you can make a case for moving anyone up into this tier.
John, what do you make of Aaron Jones? Because obviously, like, the way he finished was so strong last year, and that's easy to kind of stick in people's minds. There was a lot of the year where, I mean, there was some injury stuff in there, obviously, but, it didn't quite look the same. Obviously, changing teams. So is he somebody, RB18? It almost feels a little high from what we saw from most of the season. But again, the finish was so strong that it sounds justifiable, right, too? So where are you ranking Jones?
You say everyone remembers, but clearly the Packers don't remember that Aaron Jones is good in the playoffs. They didn't care at all. They didn't even need to try to renegotiate his contract. They just said, all right, well, we're just moving on. Who cares? So I do worry that it's a 1-year deal. Plus, with no competition behind him, you start talking about ambiguous backfields to arbitrage. It just seems like another year, the second year in a row, to be in on Ty Chandler, because how do you prevent a pass-catching athletic running back with no competition from eventually taking over? Not only that, but Aaron Jones has obviously, including last year, dealt with injuries for his entire career. Has only been healthy for a full season one time, like James Conner. So it's a situation where, I get it. As you mentioned earlier with Alvin Kamara, there are probably going to be games where he for sure delivers. He has usable scores for fantasy. But overall, we're still going to get those usable scores if we wait on Kendry Miller and Ty Chandler, in my opinion. So I just attack the ambiguous backfields in the mid to later rounds rather than trying to reach for these guys.
Fitz, you watch the Packers as closely as anybody. Did you see anything out of Aaron Jones? I mean, he's 29 years old. Obviously, the injury history, like we mentioned. Did you see anything to make you think, actually, there's a lot of, tread left on these tires, or, you're kind of moving on?
Good when healthy. And I think he's still going to be good when healthy, but the health is certainly an ongoing concern with him.
Last thing in this tier, there's a lot of names here of veterans who have a young backfield mate who has either already surpassed them or has a chance to do so this year. David Montgomery falls into that category. Somebody it's already happened to. James Conner, a lot of people really like Trey Benson. DeAndre Swift, maybe you're a big fan of Roschon Johnson or still Khalil Herbert. Najee Harris, a lot of people really like Jalen Warren. John, is there one of those vets that you think has a chance to really kind of fall off a cliff this year?
I don't know about falling off a cliff, but if someone to take shots on Jonathan Brooks or Trey Benson, I totally get the argument. The issue is that we saw through free agency what the NFL thinks of these rookie running backs. Not only was DeAndre Swift and Tony Pollard literally the first and second running back off the board, the fact that teams last year weren't trying to do that and this year raced to the open market to just sign whoever the hell they wanted, that tells you they hated this class of running backs. But also, as Sharp Football's Rich Rebar, good friend of the show, pointed out, that this was the lowest RB1 selection in the draft. Jonathan Brooks, number 46 overall. That's the lowest RB selection in the last 10 years. Teams just didn't want these guys. So none of them actually got good capital. But again, we've talked about James Conner's health. He will deliver. I also have all the respect in the world for Drew Petzing coordinating, who schemed a running game for him last year. But overall, since we don't think Conner will just be healthy, that's where I take my shots here with Benson and the ambiguous backfield in Carolina. Although, if you get the number one running back in the Panthers, what does that even mean? What are you even getting?
Yeah. Fitz, what do you think about these vets in kind of shared backfields in this tier?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when we're in draft season, we sort of lose sight of the fact that fantasy football is this weekly game. And, we might project, we're not going to project James Conner to play 17 games. And hence, we're projecting Trey Benson for some sort of significant role in Arizona. But when James Conner is healthy, he's going to be startable every week. Yep. So even knowing that he's probably going to get hurt at some point, I like the idea of Conner in this portion of the draft. He's a guy I think I'll probably have a lot of as my RB2 in leagues, because I think he's affordable and it should be a much improved offense.
Quick note to check out the cheat sheet creator at fantasypros.com/sheet. Create a consensus cheat sheet by combining rankings from 100 plus experts. You can add tiers, notes, and player tags so you know which sleepers to target on draft day. Again, that's the cheat sheet creator at fantasypros.com/sheet. Let's move to tier 5 here. This is running back 25 through running back 36. We're starting to get into the bigger tiers here. And it's Tony Pollard, Raheem Mostert, Javonte Williams, Jalen Warren, Nick Chubb, Brian Robinson, Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, Tajay Spears, Austin Eckler, Gus Edwards, and then Jonathan Brooks all the way down at RB 36. John, what was your big takeaway from this group?
This is probably where I start rounding on my RB2, honestly, because like Fitz mentioned, we always forget this, but when you're drafting, you're still trying to add usable weeks. I think everyone gets confused in trying to add 17 usable weeks when that's literally not the game we play and are talking about right now. Like the game we play at fantasy football, it happens in pockets. It happens 2 to 4 weeks at a time. So I don't care about 17 game starters. I'm trying to get the highest usable scores possible every single week. And guys, like I think the analogy is perfect for Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. I have no idea who and when each player is going to score, but honestly, both are probably going to be good, especially in what we expect to be a pass-happy offense. Not the way I would have built the Titans offense, but Brian Callahan came out and very clearly showed in protecting Will Levis's blind side with the top 10 pick, with adding Calvin Ridley for the most guaranteed money on the market, and then having 2 pass-catching running backs. He showed what they're trying to do in Tennessee. He's not hiding the fact they are going to pass. And we know targets are worth more, especially in PPR leagues for running backs. So this tier, I think, is where I get a little more excited, honestly.
Fitz, what do you think about these names? There's a lot of them here. So, there's some in this grouping that I feel pretty excited about, at least, at value. And then there's some that I don't really have any interest in. What do you think?
Yeah, there are some interesting guys. Like I'm not betting on an Austin Eckler rebound after what we saw last year, where he just things looked so dismal. I don't really want to bet on the injury optimism with Nick Chubb. But there are some interesting players like we have no idea how Arthur Smith is going to work his backfield in Pittsburgh. And Jalen Warren is a pretty talented dude. So rather than paying the freight on Najee, like I wouldn't mind throwing a dart at Jalen. Javonte Williams, now that he's more than a full year and a half plus removed from a major injury, didn't show much last year. But Sean Payton has long gotten like fantasy relevance out of multiple backs. And I don't care if he does have to share some work with Jaleel McLaughlin or Audric Estime. Like we saw like the Ingram Kamara backfield work out pretty well from a fantasy standpoint for years, or the Reggie Bush, Pierre Thomas backfield before that. So I don't mind making a bet on Javonte now that the market has cooled considerably. So there are a lot of names here, like at the right price, might intrigue me in a draft.
I'm also high on Zach Moss. We talked about fitting players into the buckets they belong, and I don't think the timeshare is as much in Cincinnati as everyone perceives, since Chase Brown is still a day 3 back who couldn't earn touches as a rookie. Everyone remembers the long screen he took to the house, but all the other touches did not matter whatsoever, whereas Zach Moss has been a workhorse multiple years, including last year. He had 2 seasons. Jonathan Taylor's injured that first portion. Zach Moss comes back in week 2, and he gets every single touch, and he's literally the second best back in the league behind Christian McCaffrey. Then the next time Jonathan Taylor was injured, Zach Moss got every touch, and he turned back into Zach Moss. But the fact is, he still earned every touch opportunity, which Chase Brown didn't, we still question that as a day 3 option. So I like Zach Moss. And then one quick more, I wish the run out was better for Austin Eckler personally, because I want to be higher than the field after last year. Like he suffered that high ankle sprain despite avoiding the second most tackles in week 1. He was the RB3 overall in week 1, I believe. He was awesome. And then he came back from that ankle sprain and averaged 3.1 yards per carry. He was awful from that point forward because of that injury. It seems like a chance to bounce back. At the same time, they did add so many options that could take away from Eckler's target share, like a Luke McCaffrey, a Ben Sinnott. So we'll see how that goes. But in PPR leagues, I still like Eckler too.
Can I push back on Daigle a little bit about the Cincinnati situation? Moss did have a great start to the season last year, but again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about my excitement of seeing Jonathan Taylor play with Anthony Richardson. Like Zach Moss got to play with Anthony Richardson and like had some huge weeks and looked like a star, showed us something we had never before seen from him, like in his Buffalo days. And then later in the season, after Richardson was out for the year, from week 6 on, Zach Moss averaged 3.6 yards per carry. He looked a lot like the Zach Moss we had seen for the entirety of his career to that point. So, like, I do think Moss, as of now, is the better bet to be the primary early down back guy for the Bengals. And I think Moss has no chance to be the passing down guy because Chase Brown is just a better third down threat, I think. And the thing is, though, if Moss does lose some of that early down work, with him not having much of a chance to be the passing down back, like I think his value is just going to absolutely tank if they do give Chase Brown some of that. And I think Brown is the more explosive guy. He's a guy who showed at Illinois that he can handle a huge workload if they need him to. He averaged like 27 carries a game his last year at Illinois. So maybe it is, in fact, like just clear division of labor, Moss, the early down guy, and Chase Brown, the passing down back. But man, I do not want to bet on it as a certainty, because I feel like at this price point, you're almost saying that Zach Moss is definitely going to be the early down back, and I'm not sure if that's going to be the case.
Fitz, I'm a little disappointed that you felt you had to cut in to address that. If you think that you and I haven't done enough shows this offseason for me to know that I needed to toss it to you after that Zach Moss, Chase Brown discussion, we simply aren't operating on the same level of mutual respect that I assumed.
That's right. I know. I should have known you were going to tee me up for that one, Worm. I apologize. Well,
I was assuming we were going to get your obligatory Chase Brown mention in the next tier when he got brought up. And then as soon as John brought up Zach Moss, I knew it was coming. So I'm glad he brought that up. Last thing on this tier, if you had to pick one guy in here, and Fitz, I'll start with you, who not just might be in tier 4 by the end of the season, but maybe multiple tiers up, tier 3 or higher. Is there any one name that stands out as could be a big upside play here?
Oh, man. I feel like Javonte kind of catches that. And I mean, this feels like such a fish answer. But man, what if Gus Edwards does get all the early down work and goal line usage for the Chargers, who obviously want to be run heavy with Greg Roman as the OC and Jim Harbaugh as the head coach? Like, I mean, as much as I'm normally repelled by the archetype of Gus Edwards type running backs, like I have to concede that like he could have a, 900-yard rushing, 12 touchdown season and like pay a big return on where he's being drafted. And, everyone is saying, why didn't we see that coming? Or why didn't we see that coming?
It's an interesting point because every single move this organization has made this offseason, they have been screaming to us that they want to run the ball heavily, from the coaching hires, from the way they have not necessarily addressed the wide receiver position outside of Lad McConkey. And it's like almost like people don't really want to believe it totally. They still have Justin Herbert. Like, obviously they're going to be really good, whatever. But I think he's a possibility there for sure if he really does kind of run away with the carries and those goal line opportunities. John, what do you think? Is there one name in here that you think maybe has multi-tier moving up upside?
It's so ugly. I know you both disagree, but I think it would be Zach Moss or Devin Singletary, players I'm willing to wait on and draft. It's more about, for me, what I'm trying to dodge here. We didn't even talk about Nick Chubb. We don't know if and when Nick Chubb's even going to come back. That's why I think if, as we move along here, I think Jerome Ford's the guy who we're really talking about could bounce 2 tiers just because having a higher floor and now ceiling as well, since we're taking Kareem Hunt out of the offense without Nick Chubb.
I agree that it's kind of a tough tier to answer that question for, which is why I picked this tier to ask it, because there's not a lot of names. I'm a little interested in going back to with Tony Pollard and saying, he himself said that it wasn't until week 11 where he really started to feel fully healthy again. They did pay him in Tennessee. I know we like Tyjae Spears as well. I'm not the biggest Will Levis fan. There's a chance that they've put so much around him now that the offense is somewhat competent and that Pollard ends up being the guy there. So I think that, he is at the top of this tier. So I guess it's kind of an easy person to point out. I think there's room for upside there considering how excited Debro had him as RB1 last year. So I think there's some room for somewhere between RB1 and RB25.
Go ahead, Fitz.
Oh, I was just going to say the scariest thing about Pollard is that Tyjae Spears is good. Like that's the one concern I have with Pollard.
The good thing is Ezekiel Elliott was a workhorse for the entire time Pollard was there, and we're only 1 year removed from Pollard being the RB9 in points per game behind Ezekiel Elliott. So he's already shown in a timeshare he can get there for us. So I don't hate the Pollard call at all.
Yeah. And it's not like I'm saying you should draft him, RB15 or whatever. But if you're playing in this sandbox in this range, then I think there's upside there. Let's go to tier 6 here to wrap things up. This is a lot of names. It's RB37 through RB51. I'll read them quickly. Ezekiel Elliott, Chase Brown, Trey Benson, Zach Charbonnet, Jerome Ford, Chuba Hubbard, Blake Corum, Antonio Gibson, Ty Chandler, Rico Dowdle, Tyler Algier, Kendre Miller, Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson, and at 51 is J.K. Dobbins. So Fitz, obviously a lot of names thrown your way there. Like I said, you've already gotten your obligatory Chase Brown mention in. So besides him, is there anybody else you want to highlight?
I mean, Zeke is sort of intriguing. I hate to say it, like going down the road with old backs. But look at what Zeke was doing as a pass catcher last year in New England. I don't know if he has that sort of role as a like receiver coming back to Dallas, but like if they don't think Rico Dowdle is good enough to play significantly, like, we're not going to see vintage Zeke, but we could see a lot of Zeke, enough touches where we're starting him week in, week out. Daigle mentioned Jerome Ford, especially as much as Kevin Stefanski likes to run the ball. Like, I think he's a great value. I clicked the draft button on Jerome Ford less than an hour before this podcast in a best ball draft. So yeah. I'm high on him. Like, a lot of these guys are really intrigued. Kendre Miller, because what I was saying earlier about the Saints and who they've brought in to coordinate their running game. So there are probably going to be 2 or 3 guys from this tier who are drafted in the first 4 rounds in 2025 fantasy drafts.
John, anybody here that you really like that you think maybe deserves to be up in tier 5, or at the very least you're happy to draft in tier 6?
Feel like I'm going to have a lot of Ford, as Fitz mentioned. Also, we talked about Ty Chandler. I'm going to keep on drafting Ty Chandler just as a 95th percentile athlete with only Aaron Jones. We talked about often injured running back on a 1-year deal, not going to be with the team the following year. I always target those ambiguous backfields. So drafting Chandler a lot. The other one I really haven't talked about because we touched on Ramondre Stevenson. I think the Patriots' backfield under a new coach is a little more ambiguous than others are giving it credit for. First off, Antonio Gibson got $5.3 million guaranteed. For reference, Derrick Henry got $9 million guaranteed. I know it's a difference, but it's not a significant difference. Not only that, Antonio Gibson is quietly 4 months younger than Ramondre Stevenson, although it seems like Gibson's 30 years old for how long we've done this. Gibson also has a 300 touch season under his belt. Ramondre does not. Gibson's never dropped below an 8% target share for his entire career because he's a pass-catching back and a good one at that. Ramondre Stevenson has. There are a lot of reasons to believe Gibson not only works himself into a timeshare here, but is just the outright touch leader at season's end. So I'll be touting Gibson a lot in August for everyone.
Fitz, of the Bears guys here, Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson, they're going back to back. Do you have a preference between the two if you're not drafting DeAndre Swift but want to have a piece of this backfield?
I guess Roshan, just because I think he's got a broader skill set, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that call, admittedly.
I was going to say Khalil just in case he's traded. So that tells you the level of confidence we're working with the Chicago's backfield.
Fitz, I know that you were very high on Blake Corum during the draft process. Given the landing spot, given the fact that we're maybe a little lower on Kyren Williams, at least I know John and I were kind of feeling that way. Is he somebody that you would be interested in as a backup in an offense where if he were to ever, like if Kyren is hurt, if he's elevated into RB1 status, we'll probably get a very good workload?
Oh, yeah. And we see him basically having the role that Kyren had last year where he's getting 20 plus touches a game. Like, not optimal for a back that small, but like he's probably better built to take that sort of a workload than Kyren is. And yeah, so like there is at worst, they use Kyren in much the same way they used him last year. And Corum is just a kind of a useless handcuff for you. A lottery ticket if something happens to Kyren, but maybe he takes a bigger chunk of the workload than we're anticipating, and it's more of a committee than we expect. And if anything were to happen to Kyren, like Corum's just so potentially, his implied value is so huge that like it's worth throwing a late round dart at him, I think.
And honestly, we should probably have Marshawn Lloyd for that same reason up here. Similar capital. The Packers out of camp are already talking about a committee, and we've talked about Josh Jacobs just potentially hitting his floor without even having a played for snap for Green Bay. So I like Lloyd since like an Aaron Jones, I'm not really counting A.J. Dillon as competition since we've seen the A.J. Dillon. Fitz has seen every snap of the A.J. Dillon experience the last couple of years. Every single time, I love the guy, but every single time he gets the ball, it's literally a negative play for them. So I think Lloyd is pretty much going to open the year as the RB2, and you could argue then we need to have him at the back half of the season on our teams.
Yeah, Lloyd just barely misses the cut. He's RB53 for the record. Go ahead, Fitz.
Yeah, I mean, and this sort of goes back to the conversation about Josh Jacobs, but like Matt LaFleur has always been a running back by committee guy. And so like we do have good reason to think that Marshawn Lloyd is going to be better than A.J. Dillon. Like that's kind of almost a given at this point. And I think it was our friend J.J. Zacharyson who just pointed out on Twitter that it was Matt LaFleur calling the plays for the Tennessee Titans in 2018 when he gave Dion Lewis 155 carries when he had Derrick Henry on the team. Dion Lewis only had 60 fewer carries than Derrick Henry that year. So like anyone hoping for like 250 plus carries out of Josh Jacobs this year might be sorely disappointed.
The last name I want to specifically highlight here, and Fitz, I know that you are like very out on him. We've talked about him on other shows. J.K. Dobbins, like I get it. If you just have no faith in the health, I will not argue against that. Like that's a reasonable stance to have. Greg Roman was the Ravens offensive coordinator when they drafted J.K. Dobbins. He has talked about how much he likes J.K. Dobbins. The Ravens liked Dobbins better than Gus Edwards when both were healthy. It's just that Dobbins wasn't healthy. If we get lucky and Dobbins is healthy and you're taking him outside the top 150 picks on draft day, it's a round where you're just hoping to get lucky with any of these guys anyway. If you get lucky and Dobbins is healthy, I think there's a possibility that he is the back to own in a backfield that, again, we just talked about with Gus, wants to run and, lean on the run and use the run, score touchdowns and make big plays. Like that's what Greg Roman designs offenses to do. And J.K. Dobbins is really talented. Maybe he's not as talented with all the injuries he's had, but it happened very early in the year last year. So he said, we'll have basically had an entire year to recover. I think there's upside there where he's going. Fitz, I know that you are not the strongest Dobbins believer at this point, so I'll go to John. Is there any legitimacy there, or are you also just kind of out given the injuries?
I think you have the process correct, but you're not going to hear me say J.K. Dobbins. With these last round picks, I'm trying to go for youth. I'm trying to go for upside here. I just legitimately question how much juice is left in the tank with Dobbins following 2 major surgeries in back-to-back years. So I'm actually instead going to Kamani Vidal, the Chargers' 6th round pick, 86th percentile athlete with at least 230 touches under his belt in back-to-back seasons his last 2 years in college. And to your point, Ryan, to that process, like we know the Chargers want to be bottom 5 in the league in pass attempts. They want to run the ball and play defense with this fortified offensive line. And so I think it could ultimately lead to Vidal being like a second half breakout guy. I've been pill brain because I'm playing so much best ball, and Vidal's like a 12th or 13th round selection. It's too early, arguably. In redraft leagues, no one's going to know who he is. You get him in the last round, you stash him. That's my target personally.
Yeah, I like that call too. He's been a target of mine in rookie drafts for sure. By the way, Fitz, as almost as if to highlight the absurdity of me even bringing up Dobbins' name, I just refreshed our expert consensus rankings, and since the time we put together the show sheet and today, he has actually dropped a spot and is now in tier 7. So he shouldn't have even been in this discussion as he was 2 days ago. But I know that you're also out on him.
He might be dropping further as this podcast makes the rounds for him.
I think that's possible. Any other final thoughts on the position as a whole? I know we talked about it a bit at the top. Fitz, any other names? I know we mentioned Marshawn Lloyd. Anybody else that maybe should be up in this tier range? Any other strategy thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, give yourself a chance to get lucky at running back, because I think at wide receiver, what you pay for is generally what you get. Like the guys you draft, top 20 receivers are usually pretty safe investments. Top 20 running backs, much less so. And I think we saw with the last year, I want to say it was like of the running backs drafted top 10 or who had top 10 ADPs, I think only 4 of them were top 15 in fantasy points per game. So, that's not to say you're going to ignore the position completely in the early rounds, but I think a robust running back strategy is really risky.
The way the league is headed, Pat, to add context to all that, because I completely agree, is that not only we're seeing more committees for every team, which is why Christian McCaffrey stands atop by himself, but also last year, 11 players had at least a 28% target share, which is the most players in the last decade. What's happening, I think, if we look just from the top down, is that college offenses are being run different. They're collegiate schemes. And so rookies are now playing more, but that's not necessarily a good thing. That's why like veterans and maybe like the high draft capital rookies, the first round Marvin Harrison, Rome Odunze's of the world, are actually like commanding targets at a higher rate because the rookies are still learning how to play professional football when they're drafted. And because of that, wide receivers deserve our picks in the first 3-4 rounds because they're the ones earning more targets, the elite guys. And that's just the way fantasy football kind of works itself out now, is to avoid the committee backs with those early picks and instead go to the high target share guys. So yeah, I agree with the way Fitz drafts. I think that's how you do it in 2024.
We'll go ahead and wrap up there. Fitz, it's the rare episode we get out of here in under an hour. But that was chock full of great info. I thought that was a really fun episode. So we'll get out of here on that. Thank you again to John Daigle for joining us. Again, Establish the Run. You can find him there. And obviously you can find Fitz and myself here at Fantasy Pros. For those guys, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.